Should I begin?
Yeah, we can. You can begin. Yeah, sure.
Okay. Thank you. Hello, everyone. On behalf of the International Institute for Population Sciences, Mumbai Short-Term Training Program Publication Cells, and on my behalf, it is such a pleasure to extend my heartiest welcome to all of you all on the occasion of World Population Day 2021. This is the second year we are commemorating World Population Day Symposium via virtual platform. I'm so looking forward to the next 90 minutes journey together with such an incredible audience. The ongoing pandemic has impacted the lives of one and all in many ways. We have lived a life for nearly 2 years now, which I don't think anyone ever imagined, even in our wildest dream. As we call it, the new normal is full of challenges, especially for some of us who otherwise have lived a life where happiness meant meeting, talking, and interacting with others in person. Contrary to this, today avoiding physical contact, maintaining a safe distance, and remaining behind closed walls has become a new mantra for a safe and healthy life, so contrary to what we otherwise are typically used to. Not only this, uncertainties associated with the COVID-19 pandemic have not reduced either. Our experiences of the past few months suggest that the second wave of COVID pandemic has been a lot more burdensome and challenging. Several issues have emerged. For example, how fast the infection spreads, who amongst us is at high risk of getting the disease, why is infection more common in some areas than others, what is the fatality rate, is our health system prepared to deal with epidemic, can something be done to prevent people from getting the disease or the infection, and so many more questions that have emerged in past few months particularly. Amongst these questions, two issues I very strongly think have been at the top of almost all debates in recent times. Providing treatment and care for the infected persons has exposed already inadequate, inaccessible public health delivery system in most of the low and middle income countries, including India. Leave aside the quality of the services. At the same time, there is an urgent need to prevent the further spread of the disease in the future. It will be a massive challenge for the countries like India to vaccinate their population to protect them against such diseases. Given this, to observe the World Population Day 2021, we at IIPS chose to discuss on COVID-19 challenges for healthcare delivery and vaccination drives in India. I'm confident that today's event would give us much needed platform to discuss and debate on issues and challenges of the COVID-19 vaccination program, as well as health delivery system in India. With us, we have two very distinguished and highly accomplished speakers. Our first speaker is Dr. Gagandeep Pang, Professor, the Wellcome Trust Research Laboratory Division of the Gastrointestinal Sciences at Christian Medical College, Bangalore. She will be delivering on COVID-19 vaccination program in India, issues and challenges. The second speaker is Dr. Sudha Ramani. She is an independent consultant on health system and policy research. She will speak on health delivery system and COVID-19 in India, issues and challenges. Professor K.S. James, the Director and Senior Professor at the IIPS, is the chair for the symposium. Before I hand it over to Professor James, I would request all of you all to type in your questions or comments or suggestions, queries in the chat box and share them with everyone. After both presenters have completed their presentation, I shall read these questions, comments out to the speakers for their reflections. I now request Professor James to open the symposium and carry forward the proceedings. Thank you very much for joining us. Professor James, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Sharam and Dr. Gagandeep Kang, Professor at the Christian Medical College, Vellore, Dr. Sudha Ramani, Professor Sharam, Professor Archana Roy, and members of our faculty, members of our former faculty. I see Professor Saxena, Professor Prakasham, Professor Ram, and many others also here, and also my dear students. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome you all once again on behalf of the Publication Committee, as well as the members of IAPS family for the World Population Day. I think it's the second year in a sequence we celebrate this World Population Day virtually in the context of a COVID pandemic. I remember last year when I was starting the World Population Day, I was mentioning that, normally we really organize World Population Day in a theme which is very related to population and development or related themes. But we have deviated last year thinking that, this is an exceptional year. But unfortunately, we need to continue our trend. We are still in a pandemic. So we thought it is the right time really to reflect further on the pandemic. Perhaps I think there are two important questions which comes to all of our mind in a period of pandemic. The one question is that what's the impact of pandemic, particularly being a demographer or public health specialist, we always ask, what's its impact on the health system? What is its impact on the maternal and child health services? What is its impact on overall health? That is actually one of the important questions which comes to our mind. I think the second, perhaps the important question, which is we always try to address, is when is it going to end? What is the way out of this pandemic? I think that is another important aspect we need to really look at. I think today's two talks are primarily revolved around these two important aspects. The latter question, when it is going to end, critically also depends on what would be the India's success on the vaccination and what are the challenges we are facing. How do we really move out of this pandemic will be depending on our success in vaccination. How is the health system affected? I think that is another important question, which we all are really worried, because as a demographers, we have been concerned with actually how is it going to affect the fertility or the births, how it is going to affect the mortality, how it is going to affect migration. I think the first wave of pandemic, I think the migration has dominated the discussion compared to the fertility and mortality. But when we move to 2021 with the second wave of the pandemic, I think more of a question is asked, will it have any impact on the births? Will it have any impacts on the mortality? Or what will be this impact on the public health services, particularly the maternal and child health services? I think the initial consideration was that, for the birth, it can even lead to a baby boom. But of late, I think if many of the papers which is coming out from across the countries of the world is also suggesting that it is not going to be a baby boom, but rather a baby burst, which perhaps is the result of the pandemic. We really don't have limited data really to look at all those things at this point, but we can perhaps even speculate what would be the possible impact on this pandemic. And I don't think that we need to really talk about the mortality aspect, which we all know that the current estimates definitely will be an underestimate. Even the HMIS data, which gives you almost 2 times higher than the mortality experience, the actual number of mortality compared to the previous years. So that way, even the official statistics also tells you is much higher mortality rate rather than what was there in India previously. So it all indicates that there has been a substantial effect. It can be a pure COVID mortality. It can be COVID-related mortality. It can be because of all other factors, but we need to take all these things into consideration. Perhaps one of the successes, I would say, that the maternal and child health services, which we all expected it will have radically affected, but India's health system appears to be resilient to some of at least to take care of the maternal and child health services. I think whether it is for public or private, I include all of the services together. But some of the studies, even IAPS, under the aegis of Population Research Center with the guidance of Usha Ram, etc., showed that hardly, I think, the public health service, the maternal and child health services got that much affected, at least in the first wave of pandemic. I don't know, we don't know, second wave has been much more intense, much more drastic. So we have limited information from the second wave still really to make some valid conclusion. I know I don't need to really get into this because we have these two eminent scholars today to speak to us about these two important topics. when can we really get out of this pandemic through vaccination? What is really the impact of our pandemic on our services, particularly health delivery services? So I look forward to their talk. I am really thankful to each of them, Dr. Gangadeep Kang, and also to Dr. Sudha Ramani for agreeing to our invitation and talk on this important day. And World Population Day is so important a day for demographers. We always celebrate it as a big event, but unfortunately, we are not able to host you in campus and also extend our hospitality. But I think this world is a virtual world, so we need to really have celebration, everything virtually. So thank you so much, and we look forward to your talk. So over to Usharam to take forward the further part of this program.
Thank you very much, Professor James. So we would have our first speaker, Dr. Gagandeep. Before I request her to make the presentation, I would like to read out few of her achievements that I think it's not that all of us don't know about it, but I think it's very important for us to reiterate the kind of speaker that we have been able to put today for our World Population Day Symposium. So for some of us who are not as aware about it, I'll read out few things about Dr. Gagandeep. Professor Gagandeep Kang is Professor of Microbiology at Wellcome Trust Research Laboratory, Division of Gastrointestinal Sciences at the Christian Medical College, Bangalore. Until very recently, Dr. Gagandeep also served as a clinician scientist and ex-executive director of the Translational Health Science and Technology Institute, Faridabad, an autonomous institution under the Department of Biotechnology, Ministry of Science and Technology. Gagandeep is known for her interdisciplinary research studying the transition, development, and prevention of enteric infections and their sequelae in children in India. She has worked on developing and using vaccines for rotaviruses, cholera, and typhoid, conducting large studies to define burden, test vaccines, and measure their impact. Dr. Kang has developed an oral vaccine against rotavirus. The vaccine was first identified in 1985 by researchers at the All India Institute of Medical Sciences, New Delhi, with over $100 million funding from Government of India and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. It is now part of India's approved vaccines. To support public health, she has built national rotavirus and typhoid surveillance networks and has also established laboratories to support vaccine trials. She has conducted phase 1 to 3 clinical trials of vaccines, a comprehensive approach that supported 2 WHO pre-qualified vaccines made by 2 Indian companies. She is investing the complex relationship between infection, gut function, and physical and cognitive development, and also is seeking to build stronger human immunology research in India. What is beautiful about Dr. Kang's work is that she meticulously combines field epidemiology with intensive laboratory investigations to develop data, insight, and tools that have facilitated advancement in both science of infectious diseases and policies in India. Her groundbreaking work has been recognized with numerous awards and honors that she has been conferred with. In 2006, she received Women Biostatisticians of the Year award from Government of India. In 2016, she was awarded Infosys Prize for Life Sciences. I feel proud to say that Gagandeep, also known as India's vaccine godmother, is the first Indian woman to be elected as a fellow of Royal Society. In 359 years of history of this prestigious scientific academy, this is the first time an Indian woman scientist is elected. Dr. Gagandeep, along with other Indian Royal Fellows, has joined the likes of Isaac Newton, Charles Darwin, Albert Einstein to be elected in the oldest scientific academy. In addition to her pioneering research in low resource settings, she contributes to the biomedical sciences through services on numerous national and international editorial boards, research grants review boards, and scientific advisory committees, including the Wellcome Trust UK, the DBT Wellcome Trust India Alliance, the International Vaccine Institute, and the International Center for Genetic Engineering and Biotechnology. She is Vice Chair of the Board of the Coalition for Epidemic preparedness innovations, and a welcome trust nominated board member of Hillman Laboratories, a partnership that supports development of affordable vaccines in low and middle income countries. She is a member of several advisory committees for the WHO, mainly related to research and use of vaccines. She has also established a very intensive training program for students and young faculty in clinical translational medicine. The program aims to build a cadre of clinical researchers studying relevant problems in India. So with that, I request Professor Kang to deliver a talk for the symposium. Thank you very much. Professor Kang, yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Usha, for having me here and for that very, very long and very, very generous introduction. I feel like I don't even quite recognize myself when I hear a description like that. So I hope you can see my slides now. I'm going to spend the next 20-25 minutes quickly taking you through the COVID-19 vaccination program in India and a special focus on issues and challenges that face us today. So we all know now that there are many, many kinds of vaccines for COVID-19. And my simplest way of describing them is that if we look at older technologies, we have the technologies that gave us live attenuated and inactivated vaccines, or vaccines that are based on recombinant DNA technology, which are the virus-like particles and recombinant DNA or protein vaccines. These vaccines, we have had this technology for, in some cases, more than 200 years. In other cases, for at least 40 years. And shown in the row at the bottom are the new technology vaccines, which are the vectored vaccines, DNA and RNA vaccines. These are vaccines that we have had not even for 5 years as yet. The first vectored vaccines that were licensed only in 2019, and a subsequent one in early 2020 for Ebola. And then we have had the vectored vaccines that have been developed for SARS-CoV-2. The first DNA vaccine is our Zydus Cadila vaccine. And the first mRNA vaccines that started to be used in humans for infectious diseases were developed only last year and started to be used in December. So where are we overall with vaccines? We have over 100 vaccines that are in clinical trial, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, where they are being assessed for their safety, their ability to induce an immune response, and their efficacy. We also have 17 vaccines that are already in use in humans, either limited use in some countries or being used in many countries around the world. And we have 5 vaccines that came into human clinical trials that have now been abandoned. Now, in May last year, I worked with the WHO team that developed a target product profile. And at that time, we thought that SARS-CoV-2 vaccines were going to be like influenza vaccines. So we thought we were being very ambitious in asking for a vaccine that would have more than 50% efficacy, that could deliver that with not more than 2 doses, something that would be useful in adults and would give protection for 6 months. Actually, we know that we have gone well beyond our target for the vaccines that we have developed. Listed here on this slide are vaccines for which we have efficacy data available. So Pfizer, BioNTech, Moderna, these are 2 mRNA vaccines. We also have a bunch of adenovirus vectored vaccines, the Oxford AstraZeneca Covishield vaccine, the Gamaleya vaccine from Russia, Sputnik V, or CanSino Bio from China. These are all adenovectored vaccine, and Janssen is an adenovectored vaccine that is given as a single dose. Then we have inactivated vaccines from Sinopharm, from Sinovac, and Covaxin. And we have a number of vaccines that are protein vaccines. So from Cuba, we have Soberana and Abdala. These are protein vaccines, both of which have been shown to have high efficacy. Soberana about 67%, Abdala about 92% in data that came out in the last couple of weeks. And we have the Indian Zydus Cadila vaccine, where we had an announcement just a week ago to say that 3 doses of the vaccine give about 67% protection. And this vaccine is under consideration with DCGI now. We also have another subunit vaccine, Novavax, and this vaccine gives efficacy that is comparable to that of the mRNA vaccines. So starting from a target product profile that in hindsight does not look particularly ambitious, we are currently in a situation where we have shown that many kinds of vaccines are available and give us high levels of protection. But still, there are many questions that remain. What about in India? In India, we have currently 3 vaccines, Covishield, Covaxin, and Sputnik. Covishield is a vaccine that makes up about 88% of the use in India. Covaxin, I'm sorry, that is 12% of the use in India, not 102%. And this has been tried in India in almost 26,000 participants. Studies were planned for 5,000 participants in Brazil, but this may not happen now. Sputnik V had its trials mostly in Russia and in Eastern Europe, and it was evaluated in 1,600 participants in India, rather like the Covishield vaccine. All of the vaccines have good efficacy data, and there has been a safety signal that has been noted with the Covishield vaccine, which is the thrombosis with thrombocytopenia syndrome, which is a very rare side effect of vaccination with the Covishield vaccine. And recently it has been described with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine also. Now, what's coming in the future? In the future, in addition to the 3 that we have, we are going to have a lot more vaccines. So Zydus Cadila, I mentioned, is under review. We have protein vaccines, we have mRNA vaccines, we have a bunch of other vectored vaccines, and some live attenuated vaccines that are in development. Of these, currently the ones that are in human clinical trials are the biological E vaccine, the Genova vaccine, the Novavax vaccine from Serum Institute, which have all gone into clinical trials in India. For import, Moderna, we've got import permission from the DCGI. The donated doses will be brought in by Cipla, but commercial arrangements are still in discussion. And similarly, discussions are ongoing for Pfizer and for J&J, where we hope to be able to get 100 million doses of the J&J vaccine even before BioE begins to make that vaccine in India. So even though things may not seem particularly good in India at the moment, hopefully the future will be better. Now here I'd like to walk you through these graphs, and in the first graph, which is the daily new confirmed cases, which is shown as a 7-day average. Basically, what I want to show you is just the data from June 10th to July 10th. And what you can see here is that even though our spike went up very sharply and our spike came down very sharply, actually there is a long tail, and we are finding it difficult to get below the 40% mark. And I'd just like to point out that 40% is half the height of the peak that we had in the first wave. The second thing I'd like to show you is in terms of COVID-19 vaccine doses administered, China has been vaccinating its population very aggressively. but India comes second in terms of the number of doses that have been given. The United States had vaccinated much of its population, but just in terms of numbers of doses, India has now overtaken the US. Now, what does this mean in terms of the percentage of the population vaccinated? This means that less than a quarter of our population has actually received even one dose of vaccine. And when it comes to the proportion that has received 2 doses of vaccine, that is just above 5%. And that is what is shown here in this map. Now, in this very spiky graph, which is on the top of your screen to the right, what I'd like to show you is the COVID-19 vaccine doses administered per 100 people. And this is again a 7-day rolling average. What you can see here is that there have been lots of times when we have been able to achieve a lot of vaccination. But there have been also a lot of troughs. And what I'd like to show you here now is the same figure shown now as daily doses given with the events at each time in our vaccination program. So we started on January 16th with healthcare workers. On February 1st, we added essential workers. On March 1st, we added the over 60-year-olds with the over 45-year-olds with comorbidities. On April 1st, we added all 45-year-olds. And then on May 1st, we made it all adults. But on April 19th, we announced a new policy for state and private sector purchase. And what I'd like to point out to you is where this policy was announced. You can see that coverage was decreasing at that time. At a time when you have priority populations, you're going up all the way to almost mid-April, and then the coverage starts to decline. At that point, you announce a policy making many, many more people eligible. And this resulted in a lot of confusion, for one. And it also resulted in a decline in coverage because, quite frankly, supply was not able to keep up with the convoluted requirements for vaccinating different sections of the population from doses that came from different places. Fortunately, at the end of May, this policy was rolled back on June 21st, which is the peak of our ability to deliver vaccines. We then switched back to central purchase for all vaccine supplies, but private sector purchase of 25% still continues. As you can see here, the peak shows us what it is possible for us to achieve. We can get to 8 million doses. We have the capacity to deliver 8 million doses a day. However, we have been unable to sustain that level of immunization. And a key element of why we are unable to sustain that level is something we will discuss shortly. So what are the issues and challenges? These are my top 10 issues and challenges. I could probably come up with a lot more, but I'll walk you quickly through these. First and most important is supply. And I think it's important that we are honest about what is likely to be available with us. That has not been the case so far. On the 15th of May, we were told that 2.16 crores of vaccine doses would become available between August and December 2021. So we were told that these were myths about the vaccination program, to say that, these were lies that people were telling. And this messaging persisted until the end of May. And then we have here, on the 2nd of July, a report that says that actually what we said was really aspirational. It's not true. The figure has been revised to 135 crore doses and in the submission to the Supreme Court, and that may be more realistic. So vaccine supply remains an open question. I actually think, based on the little that I know, that even 135 crores is a very optimistic projection. And I just wish that we could bring ourselves to projecting reality in both what we think supply is likely to be, as well as data, as Professor James pointed out. I think honesty in measurement is a critical part of what demographers and people who deal with supply chains need to be doing. Now, in order to talk about vaccination, it's important to have a sense of scale of routine immunization. We have the biggest immunization program in the world, no question about that. We have 26 million children targeted for immunization out of our birth cohort of 27 million, 30 million pregnant women, 9 million routine immunization sessions, 27,000 cold chain stores, and at our peak, our polio vaccination campaign covered 800 million doses a year. So this is phenomenal. But that phenomenal effort was built over time. And what I'd like to show you here in these little stars and blue lines is the data over a 10-year period for vaccines that are used in the routine immunization program. And what you can see here is that with years and years and years of effort, we got to about 90% coverage in January of 2020. Subsequently, with COVID, there has been a decline. There is an increase in the number of children that are unimmunized, what are called zero-dose children. It's estimated that in India, so the WUNIC reports, which look at immunization from the WHO and from UNICEF, will be coming out this week. And what they will show is that India has added almost 1 million children to the under-immunized and unimmunized numbers. If we look at the figures that were pre-pandemic, you can see that India is the largest contributor still to the number of children that are unprotected in the world. Now, this is, of course, a function of numbers. We have the largest birth cohort in the world. We also have the largest proportion of unprotected children. But one thing I want to point out in this picture of a boat below, this is actually a COVID-19 immunization program. And you can see the lessons that we have learned from polio, the lessons that allowed us to get to 90% coverage of children, which is we use every resource that is available to us in order to be able to deliver vaccines. So I think we have the capacity. We need to build up the supply, and we need to build the partnerships that will allow us to do that. Now, moving from there to the measurement of impact, we have given out over 350 million doses of vaccine. Yet the data that we have on the impact of these vaccines is limited to small studies. This Tamil Nadu police paper is based on 110,000 policemen in Tamil Nadu. There is a similar, not yet published effectiveness analysis from the Punjab police based on another 80,000 policemen. This paper shown here that showed the effectiveness of single doses and 2 doses of vaccine is from CMC Hospital and is based on a cohort of about 10,000 employees. So how can we give out 350 million doses of vaccine and yet rely for effectiveness, for measurement of impact on tiny little pieces of data from very defined populations? We also have some data from breakthrough infections, but these are like individual case reports. Much of our understanding of how vaccines are working, particularly against specific variants, is coming to us from the UK. So for B16172, the Delta variant, we are relying on data from the UK that tells us that 2 doses of AstraZeneca vaccine give us 60% protection against symptomatic infection and about 92% protection against hospitalization. So this part, even though it, I find it depressing that we look elsewhere for data on impact. One of the good things that has happened recently is that INSACOG, which is the surveillance program that is doing sequencing, is now putting out these kinds of reports. So this is a report updated on the 21st of June, which shows us what has happened in terms of variants of concern circulating in India. So I hope that many more government agencies will follow suit, will make sure that the data that we need in order to be able to handle the pandemic does become more easily available, just like INSACOG has done. Now, I think in terms of program goals and the need for adaptation, it's very important for us to understand that the goal determines the approach that we take. So if we want to protect the health system, we need to vaccinate healthcare workers. Essential services depends on who's essential. Protecting lives, we should go by an age descending strategy. If we want to protect the economy and livelihoods, then vaccinate the working population. If you want to protect future capital, then the focus should be on educational and training establishments and vaccination of pregnant women and mothers. If we want to prevent spread of disease, then vaccination of areas where cases are climbing and vaccination of travelers. So far, we have had a one-size-fits-all strategy. And I think it's really time that we began to experiment and think about what we want our vaccination program to do and adapt our strategy accordingly. In India, currently, who decides? This is a little difficult to figure out. The WHO recommendations are very clearly for healthcare systems and for protection of lives, and this is global protection. They have recommendations that are very clear, but in India, if you look at who decides who should be vaccinated or not, we have the COVID-19 working group of NTAGI, the National Technical Advisory Group of Immunizations. We have NEGVAC, we have various empowered groups of government. So it becomes a little difficult to figure out who finally makes the decisions. Now, coming from thinking about how policy should be decided is back to data again and thinking about variants and vaccines. This has been a topic of great discussion, and shown here are the various ways in which variants are labeled. They can be labeled based on sequences. They used to be labeled based on where they came from, and WHO has now given Greek letters of the alphabet. If we look at efficacy or effectiveness against variants, we have data for a limited number of vaccines, Pfizer, AstraZeneca, and Moderna. And shown in this graph here, between alpha and delta variants, what we see is that in most situations, protection against alpha is better than protection against delta when we look at symptomatic infection for data that comes from multiple countries. However, if you look at efficacy against hospitalizations, then you find that the difference between alpha and delta is not so much. So clearly the vaccines are working. I know a lot of people worry about this, but it's important to emphasize that the most important thing is hospitalizations, and vaccines are working. This has been shown for single dose as well as 2-dose strategies. There is some diminution in efficacy with the single dose. There is considerable catch-up with the second dose. This is particularly important for the beta variant, less important really for the delta variant based on the data that are currently available to us. There's a lot of discussion also about dosing schedules, a lot of news in the media about, shortening the dose, when should we give it? but I think it's important to understand what the real issues are. And basically, there have been modeling exercises that have been conducted that indicate that what we should be going for is the greater good of the greater number. So optimizing vaccine allocation shows that single dose strategies at a time when supply is limited gives you more benefit than vaccinating a smaller proportion of the population with 2 doses. So this has been falsely characterized as leading to much less protection or leaving people unprotected. While a second dose does increase protection, it does not mean that people with a single dose are unprotected. The difference for the AstraZeneca vaccine for hospitalization is 71% for the first dose and 92% for the second dose. So good protection with 1 dose and better protection with the second dose. I'll also like to point out that the AstraZeneca vaccine works very, very well even in the elderly, and it works to prevent transmission as well. These are data from the Alpha variant. Data from the Delta variant are just emerging from the UK again and seem to be showing again good protection from vaccines. So we should not be worried about the dosing interval. Data that came out on Friday from the UK showed that it doesn't seem that Delta is more transmissible within households. It's very similar to Alpha, 1.5%, 1.7% secondary attack rates in households. It's also not more deadly. It's not causing increased levels of death. In fact, if you look at the case fatality rate, the case fatality for the Delta variant right now is lower than for Alpha and for Beta. But I will point out that this is in a situation where 51% of the UK population is immunized. So important to emphasize that it may be vaccination that is protecting and pushing the case fatality rate down. There's also a lot of discussion around mix and match strategies. There are now papers available from the CombiVax-S study in Spain and the ComCov study in the UK, mixing the AstraZeneca and the Pfizer vaccines. And the vaccines have been evaluated based on immunogenicity. Essentially, what it shows is that it's not worse than and may be better than using the same doses. So in terms of programmatic use, this is important that you can mix vaccines and still expect to have high levels of protection in your population. People are talking also about the need for booster doses and when they are likely to be required. And I like to divide it into people who are immunocompromised and people who are immunocompetent. In people who are immunocompromised because they are transplant recipients, they have autoimmune disease, cancer, or other conditions, yes, the vaccines do not result in a good response. So a small study has been done showing that if you give a 3rd dose of the vaccine, then you get a really good immune response, even in immunocompromised individuals. And that's shown here in the bar diagrams and the plot here. Also, we need to remember that not all vaccines are equal. And here is an advertisement from the government of Bahrain that says that for certain classes of people who receive 2 doses of an inactivated vaccine, please come back and get a 3rd dose with an mRNA vaccine. Finally, monitoring safety and hesitancy. These are key issues identified by the WHO, and they have taken a number of different approaches to address this. And this cartoon here illustrates what I think is happening in many situations. We are drowning in a sea of coronavirus. Vaccines can be a life raft, and we are saying no to them. So I think hesitancy is something that requires being addressed on the ground at a very local level by trusted people. The other important thing is safety concerns. Not all countries are regularly reporting adverse events. And I think educating people about adverse events and measuring adverse events is a critical part of making sure that we can get vaccines to reach people everywhere. Finally, just to tell you that vaccines aren't perfect, but vaccines are brilliant. Vaccines that prevent disease will result in your symptoms going from severe to becoming less severe. And if vaccines prevent disease and infection, we will decrease both severe disease as well as infections and therefore transmission. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Gagandeep. It was really a wonderful exposition of really more of an optimism. I think there are also pessimism because we really don't have enough data really to understand what is really happening in this country. I think that is perhaps one of the major lacunae which we are all facing. So where we need to really address. I think that has been an issue in the country, not only for even vaccine, even for the, I think this is one of the countries where even the basic information like births and deaths, which is not registered. So naturally, even that we indirectly estimate and find out what is the birth rate and death rate. So forget about vaccine. I think COVID reporting, etc. That way perhaps has been slightly better in the sense that at least we know what is really happening on the number of tests, number of positivity rate, etc. every day evening, which is not happening in any other issues, related issues in this country. So I think you also touched several issues, the efficacy, it is the possibility of we are achieving the target, and also what is the effectiveness and how do we go ahead in the future. I think I'm sure there will be a large number of questions, but let us also hear to the other presentation and come back to the question answers together. So let me now go back to Professor Usha Ram for the next, inviting the next speaker.
Thank you very much, Professor James. So our next speaker is Dr. Sudha Ramani. She is a public health professional with more than 12 years of experience in the field. Her research mainly focuses on health policies, systems, and qualitative evaluations of the program processes in India. She views health systems and interventions for a complexity lens and delves into the hows and whys of the policies and programs. Sudha holds a doctorate from School of Health and Health System Studies from the Tata Institute of Social Sciences in Mumbai. She has 2 master's degrees, one in health service research from the Department of Health Policy and Management, Boston University School of Public Health, and another one in health sciences from Pune University. She works as an independent consultant on health system and policy research at Oxford Policy Management, where she is leading a study on resilient health systems and COVID-19. She is also a part-time consultant on qualitative evaluation of health programs, mentoring qualitative study at the Society for Nutrition Education and Health Action, where her current research focuses on community responses to COVID-19 in informal urban settlements. Before this, Sudha worked with the Public Health Foundation of India, New Delhi, and its allied public health institutes in Hyderabad and Bangalore. She was the recipient of the WHO Alliance Grant of Health Policy and System Research Policy Analysis for 2 years under the mentorship of Professor Lucy Dixon. She won the Catherine Skinner Memorial Award for the Best Research Thesis at Boston University. The Public Health Foundation of India also awarded her with the Future Faculty Scholarship. She was the recipient of the Professor Sukhatme Scholarship at Pune University. Some of her research work includes looking at how we can build resilient health systems in the aftermath of COVID-19, examining the macro and micro context of primary healthcare in India and how context affects service delivery, understanding and perspective on working across 2 public sectors, that is health and nutrition, in the frontline care of India, how and why health workers in the frontline adopt certain behaviors and attitudes. Sudha has several academic publications in the field of health policy and system research. She is a health policy analysis fellow supported by the Alliance of Health Policy and System Research Switzerland for the years 2017 and 18 cohort. Winner of the Catherine Skinner Memorial Award from Boston University for her thesis work, and was a part of the high-level expert group secretariat on universal health coverage at the Public Health Foundation of India. So Sudha, now floor is all yours. Thank you very much for joining us.
Good evening. Good evening and a very warm welcome to all of you today. Thank you, Dr. Usha, for such a lovely introduction, and IIPS for this opportunity to talk and put forth my thoughts. So it's a great honor to be here and to talk after Dr. Kang and after her very rich and insightful presentation. Today, I would like to discuss another very important and relevant topic, which is health systems response to COVID-19 in India, and what have been some of the lessons we have learned for the way forward. Okay, I know we are a little of time, but I'll try to take about 20 minutes. 25 minutes is what I've been given, and moving forward. So I start with this picture of a wobbly doll. We call this the Tanjavur Bommai. It's made of mud and it's pretty fragile. But if I apply force on it anyway, upwards, backwards, it usually wobbles and dances. But very importantly, it can upright itself. It can come back to its original position. Okay, as a child, you feel this is magic. But as a student of science, you realize that this doll has been specifically designed this way. Okay, so this doll's ability to bounce back, its sort of strength to recover from force, that is not a lucky accident, but it happens because of deliberate scientific design. And this is the lesson that I would like to draw from the doll today, that if we want a health system today in India that can take this sort of shock from all sides, that's able to bounce back from viral outbreaks, okay, which is able to cope, we are not going to get such a health system by accident. We will have to sit and deliberately design and redesign this health system that we have. This doll, it also illustrates the lens that I come from. So I am a qualitative researcher. I work with complex data and evidence, but that evidence is not really numbers. So in the health policy systems work that I do, I have to ask a lot of hows and whys, and I explore ideas. And these questions may not really always get answered numerically. So this talk, today's talk, they might not have the ideas that the esteemed researchers at IIPS, they are so good, good with working with, but it relates to a very different worldview, and I engage with three sort of exploratory questions. One is, how did the public health system in India respond to COVID-19? Second, okay, if it responded in certain ways, why did it do so? What were some of the factors influencing it? And thirdly, what can we learn? And most importantly, what can we learn from this experience for the future? Okay, there are two research projects that I have to mention have influenced some of my thoughts in this presentation. One is a conceptual report, DFID funded maintains network on shock responsiveness. Okay, this work related to COVID was led by Tom Newton-Lewis and team. And the other is with an NGO in Mumbai named Sneha. And we did a study here to explore community experiences during COVID in urban informal settlements. And this study was led by Dr. Anuja Jayaraman. And although I've not quoted findings from these studies, the actual learnings from these studies have influenced my thoughts in one way or the other in this presentation. So I spoke of three questions that I would like to answer in this talk. And I think if we talk health system challenges, we've all heard in social media about it. Beds not being available, oxygen, supply of vaccines, everything. But for me as a health systems researcher, the question was, how do I actually put together all this vast information that is available? Okay, so a quantitative researcher starts looking for variables and hypotheses and causality. But as a qualitative researcher, we start looking for frameworks, theories that can really help to make sense of what is happening around us and answer those why questions. So when we started looking at some of the frameworks, we found that yes, when a shock occurs, okay, COVID-19 is a big shock to the health system. And when something like that occurs, the health system can use a mix of strategies. One is, of course, preparing, and India had a head start in preparing. So we were one of the first countries to start really preparing or issuing guidelines for COVID-19 as early as last January. Okay, and then the other three are called as absorption, adaptation, and transformation. Okay, absorption is what a sponge does. Okay, a sponge just sucks in the extra water that is there. So it's a coping strategy of the health system where with the same amount of resources, I try to absorb the additional requirements of the shock. Okay, example, like I use the same human resources in the front line to do the additional contact tracing for COVID and such things. Adaptation is a little different. When I use a little more additional resources or I have to put in different processes because the shock has some additional needs which I can't do with my present resources. So I make some new coordination cells or recruit some additional people. So all this becomes adaptation. The third, transformation, as a word suggests, is much bigger. Okay, it is when the needs of the shock are so big that we need really big changes in the health system to deal with it. Okay. But we must remember that systems need not always cope well. So they don't always do this absorption and adaptation and transformation in wonderful ways. And they can adapt in manners that do not always lead to good health outcomes. So in addition, and this part is called as maladaptation. Okay, so and in addition to maladaptation, health systems can also get overwhelmed. Okay, they can collapse under a weight of a crisis if it's too huge for them to handle. So these terms, okay, preparation, absorption, adaptation, transformation, these were the ones which literature was using to describe how systems respond to shock. Professor James was talking about this when he started he started this lecture, that when and literature sort of supports this, that when faced with a shock, health systems need to have two abilities. One is it has to scale up to address the needs of the shock. Okay, for instance, we might need new testing, different treatments, all that. But it also has one more very, very important function. Even while attending to COVID's needs, systems need to maintain routine essential service delivery. So the health system response to the shock must not substitute for these essential services, which was one of the concerns that was put in literature very often. Okay, so these two goals, okay, one is scaling up and second one is maintaining routine service delivery. Both of them are what we call important system goals, these important goals for the health system during whenever a shock happens. Okay. I know this slide is slightly heavy, but it sort of forms a basis for a lot of the work that we've been doing. Okay. So now we sort of came up with a conceptual framework using all those building blocks which are described in the earlier slide, okay, in order to examine the COVID-19 response. So this is how the conceptual framework looked like, and it says that when a shock occurs, there is this response to the shock, and this shock and the response, they interact with each other. And this is not a one-time interaction. The interaction keeps on happening. And this leads to certain system level outcomes and then to health outcomes. Okay. Yes. So now I just go on to describing this response to the shock a little more. Okay, looking a little more deeply into this block called response. And we have, of course, the public health system that is responding. But in addition, we also have the whole government responding and the private sector response. And all this is interacting with how the community is responding to the pandemic. And all these responses are being influenced by other bigger economic and political drivers at various levels. So this diagram, I think for me, it tells us two important things. Okay? One is that although we tend to connect COVID outcomes with health system challenges, because that's the direct connection we see, um, uh, uh, the outcomes are linked not just to the manner that the health system responds, but there are a lot of other factors that determine the kind of outcomes that we see in COVID and the other health outcomes. The second point is that things are so interlinked that if somebody asks me to study the health system response alone, I cannot really do it without connecting it to the other things that are happening today with relation to COVID. I think Dr. Tedros and others from WHO have been saying this again and again and again, that the most striking thing about COVID is that whole complexity of the response, the social complexities, the ecological complexities, the political complexities, and the sort of interconnections between all this, which has been happening. Okay. So in this slide, what I've done is taken from the framework and I've expanded on the public health response alone. And so I'm talking about the big black and the gray box a little more magnified. And for a moment, let's look at the big gray box, which is talking about the public systems response and some of its characteristics. So we were supposed to have a whole of government response as per the policy guidelines with focused efforts on cross-sector coordination. It was supposed to be intensive in nature, but also we regarded, say, lockdowns and things initially as temporary. Okay, the first lockdown was highly central driven, and there have been a lot of concerns that have been expressed about the public systems response, including customization, policing, social security measures, etc. But for this presentation, I think what is most important for us is that the public health system response was a part of, it sits inside this whole public systems response. And if we look at the nature of this response, we can see some positive coping attempts and some negatives or some maladaptations. So what were some of our positives, or at least things that were going in the right direction? Okay, one is that there was a lot of attempt at coordination across sectors. Second, there were attempts at making stopgap arrangements, and you heard many examples, trains being converted into, train coaches being converted into hospitals, temples being used, and all these to improve healthcare. Okay, there was a movement towards increased use of technology and digitalization. Okay, and I think out of all the positives, I would say we've seen some amazing and wonderful examples of people who have stepped up to actually cope with COVID. Okay, ASHA workers making masks and distributing it in communities. Dr. Gagandeep had shown that beautiful boat in which people are using people are so committed to do vaccinations. We've seen extreme examples of extremely committed doctors. But what is also important is that although many people stepped up, these positives that we observed were at individual levels. And these individuals were actually making up for many of the systemic deficiencies that we have. Okay. What were some of the, what we call as maladaptations? Okay. One is that I think this is something I don't even need to talk about, but we saw structural constraints. We always knew that the public health system did have structural constraints, but we saw these in a magnified manner. And the public health system, for what it's worth, tried to cope by rationing some of the public health services. And Professor James had also pointed out there has been less transparency about data. There have been groups that have been looking at actual number of cases and deaths, and debates have been going on what is being missed as counting. And in one way, this is also the less transparency about data is also a systemic maladaptation. It's a way of the system scoping. The third one that we see is overburdening of staff, okay, especially at the frontline staff, staff. And there have been a lot of discussions around protective equipment, the lack of training protocols, and all and such things. I think we should take one step back now and see, okay, if this is the kind of response that we had, why is it that we had this kind of response? Okay, why? So what factors really drove this manner of response? And that is important for us to understand. Okay. So some of the factors that we can think of, and there are many factors, so the list that I've put down here is not comprehensive at all. One of them is the nature of the shock itself, the community response, other socioeconomic factors, and what I'm going to focus on today, the health system context itself and how it affected the kind of response that it could put up. Okay. The first one is the nature of the shock and how it affected the manner of response. Okay, the virus has been a very, very, very difficult enemy. Okay, it's been difficult to predict. It's been new, so we didn't have existing testing kits and diagnostics when we first started contending with it. There are mutations which are constantly happening, waves, and all decisions which are being taken are happening in a very dynamic and unpredictable environment, and a lot of uncertainty is there. So the nature of shock itself is affecting to some extent the nature of response. Okay. The second group of factors has to do with politics, the political economy, and other issues. There's a, in fact, the Lancet Commission, of which Dr. Gagandeep is a part, is having a seminar on July 19th on the political factors that are affecting COVID. And the thing is that health systems are situated within socio-political environments, and in this they are political entities, and because of that, all health system responses also become political. The third one I'll talk about is a community response. Okay, the way the community behaves, their behavior, their attitudes, that also links to the way the public health system responds, and both these responses interact with each other. Okay, as we've been having concerns about migration in the last wave, financial insecurities. There have been direct COVID-related issues like the non-uniform compliance to COVID-appropriate behaviors, fear, and which has later led to denial, stigma, and other things. There have also been non-COVID health issues which are a problem. Although I've put the community response in one place, we have to remember that a whole lot of factors also diversify the community. The community is not one thing. And let's say there are also underlying relationships between the community and health system that determine response. For example, if I give like vaccination message today, the community does not make a decision only based on the message I'm giving today, but it also makes on this on what it has experienced in the past, on the historical nature of the health system, and it makes the whole idea of messaging much more complicated than it should be. Here I focus, in this slide, I focus mainly on the different factors in the health system that has influenced the manner of response. So if I look at the leftmost column, we have different manners of response adaptations. How the system responded by making stopgap arrangements, by rationing services, and other issues. In the middle column, we have talked a little bit about the intermediate system level drivers. Okay, if, say, for example, we were adapting by rationing services. Why is it that we were doing that? Because we didn't have the structural capacity to test or trace, etc. But what is most important to me in this slide is the big red column on the right. Okay, which sort of says why is it that our health system responded in a particular ways? What were some of the underlying systemic factors? Okay, and the first thing is, okay, just backspace. The first thing is our public health system has been chronically underfunded. We spend less than 1% of our GDP on public health, which is very low for a country like India. Underfunding over the years has manifested in the form of inadequate infrastructure, drugs, human resource constraints in many places. And in addition to in many health facilities, there's a lack of decision space for managers, resources, incentives, and all this lead to suboptimal behaviors in staff and what we call as no-do gaps. People know what to do, but they don't have the ability to do it. Okay, there is a culture of rationing. Over years, we have inculcated this culture. We have normalized this culture of rationing. We have nurtured a culture in health systems that sanctions certain practices, okay, like not sharing through data. Okay, because if you share data and present a true picture of the difficulties that you're facing, you might be named and shamed. Uh, um, we uh, we haven't really supported that kind of frontline agency and power and nurtured that kind of leadership. Okay, and all these have been some of the biggest underlying challenges that we have been facing. So our public health system today, it has its one word for it is that it's been chronically stressed over many years. And when we put the shock of the scale of COVID, which is really big, we are really stretching the public health system beyond its capacity. So if I have to tell a summary story of the health system and the way we have responded to the two ways, what I can say is not in all states, but in most states, it's an already struggling public health system in India, which had a poor baseline level of functioning, which had to face the pandemic. Okay, in many places, the underlying trust between the systems and communities was missing even at the beginning of the pandemic. So what happened when COVID entered? The political capital around COVID, it put this sort of sudden pressure on the system, and it said in order to meet the needs of COVID. So there were a lot of stopgap arrangements that were made. But even while these efforts were being made, the public system, the health system lacked the immediate capacity to implement the scale of response design that we needed in good faith. We could not build that surge capacity that we needed instantaneously. And all this speaks to, and this is, although we had good intentions, we were very quick on the feet and we started off early. And all this speaks to the inadequacies and insufficiencies in our own health system for many years. Okay, there have been some harsh inequities in our response. Dr. James mentioned how difficult it has been to measure. It's been hard to even count the extent of these inequities. How has COVID and our response affected, say, the poor more? How has it affected women more in terms of issues like domestic violence? How has it affected daily wage workers, migrants who have been more vulnerable, and certain sections of society where many people have not even been able to get diagnosed, and get access to care, or even counted among the dead. So these have been some of the issues that we have been having. But we also have to be fair, is that we have to admit that COVID has highlighted this sort of fragility of health systems all world over. Okay, countries all over the world, it is not just India. Many countries have struggled to sort of launch a balanced response to COVID-19. And it is probably easier to recognize many of the flaws that we've had in the policy response on hindsight rather than looking at it earlier. But one thing I think we've all learned is that strong, resilient health systems, they are not built during the day. And we cannot strengthen the health system in the middle of a crisis. Okay, so this is the summary story. And I think just to end on a much less negative note that I've been going on with, it has been all eyes on COVID now. And the current political attention to COVID can open an important window of opportunity to work with the health system now, okay, and we can build back better. Okay, so we should embed, so things that people have been talking about are embedding positive strategies, catching up on backlogs. There is a lot of scars at the COVID pandemic right now. It's a very difficult topic to talk about the second wave, and look at some of the challenges that the COVID has magnified and shown us. Focus on vaccinations, and importantly, consolidate learnings for the future. So the quote that says, those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it, is very, very important for us to reflect and consolidate what we learn. But these things are only the tip of the iceberg. Okay, it is time for us to make some long-term choices regarding our public health system right now. Okay, we cannot build a health system in the middle of a crisis. So our boats, if we have to deal with a storm, we have to build our boats before. We have to strengthen both hardware and software in systems. So hardware is all your infrastructure and human resources and the drug capacities. And everybody is talking about these, improving infrastructure for the second wave. But in addition, we also have to look at the software, okay? The organizational culture, which has led us not to share data, the need for better supervision practices, better leadership. And we have seen in this pandemic that these softer issues, okay, issues like nurturing good leadership in health systems are as important as the hardware. Okay. We've also seen that health systems cannot function alone. We have to make these work alongside other factors. And in the end, if to put it in one line, we have to build good institutions, not just health facilities for the future. Okay, I would like to just take an example of IIPS here. Okay, IIPS is a great institution, but it's not the infrastructure. I mean, it's not just the infrastructure or just having adequate number of staff that makes IIPS a great institution. It's the quality of people there. It's the commitment they show. It's the leadership that is available in the institution over years, which makes it such a good institution. And that is what we need for health systems today. So if we have to build better health systems in India, it has to be more than bouncing back to an old normal. I think Dr. Usha started off with this, saying that we have a new normal now. The old normal for health system has many, many flaws. And one thing that COVID has shown us, these flaws magnified. And I truly believe that if we learn, we stand at the brink of change right now. We have a very important opportunity to make long-term investments in our health system. And I hope that we make the best of it, of this change. So thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. Thank you for being a wonderful audience and this opportunity. Thank you. Over to Usha.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Sudha. I think it has been really a wonderful talk. I would say it's a very balanced talk. Usually I heard many talk, it was really more critical of what was really happening over the period. We know, all of us know that any system has to adapt to a situation, and there has been, and our public health system definitely has, as you have already mentioned, it has been chronically stretched for over a longer period of time with limited funding, with limited infrastructure and limited manpower. So there has been a series of deficiencies which all of us were aware, but suddenly with COVID, I think these are all really come to the forefront. I think it is a right time to really, in your own, the need framework terms, it is a transformation. I think that is what, that is perhaps beyond COVID, but we need to really think a real transformation of the public health system in this country. Thank you so much. I think it has been really wonderful to listen to all the framework and how we really look at through a neat framework, the issues and the concerns of the health system. I think it's really a marvelous two talks. Really enjoyed it. I'm sure there have been several questions, suggestions, and comments from the participants. Maybe let me just start with really initiating some of these discussion. Dr. Gagandeep, perhaps I think, from your talk, which I was, because I was also taking up the optimism which is coming out from your talk. I think that is also positive in the sense that, we have a large number of supply in the vaccination field might come up in the near future, because there are a lot of vaccines are coming, and if the government is able to bring them at a faster rate to the country, I think there are possibilities of expanding the supply. I think supply has been a major constraint for expanding the vaccination, as we have also mentioned that we have a history of vaccinating much more number of people rather than the limited number which we are offering for the COVID. So what do you think? I think if suppose in case the supply increases, is it that even we will be able to go beyond the target? Is it possible with if you are really an optimist? I know it's a difficult question to answer with a limited amount of data. That perhaps is one. And I was also quite impressed on the talk on prioritizing, because that's very important, because for no country, I think, in the world can really give vaccination to everyone when we have a supply shortage. So we also need to think about prioritizing. So if you really think, as a public health expert, if you think that what would be perhaps anything wrong which we have done in the prioritization, or you think that there are alternative ways of prioritizing the vaccination? Perhaps some people, there are particularly the economists think that it should have been primarily focused on the livelihood issues, because people who are working should have been given emphasis, especially the office goers. But others think that no, lives are much more important, so elderly is much more important. But in case, I know it is not an easy question to answer, but I just want to know from you some of the opinions from you. So maybe over to you, start, and then we will also open it for others.
Sure. So if we look at the aspirational goals of the government, that is, they want to vaccinate all adults. So approximately 70% of the population, 950 million people with 2 doses of vaccine. So 2 billion doses of vaccine to be given by the end of the year. And at this time, 350 million have been given. So we are 1/7 of the way there. So I think we are not going to get there. Not by the end of 2021. We may get there by the middle of 2022. And that's not bad. That's going to put us in a position that is far ahead of many other middle-income countries. So definitely ahead of low-income countries, but ahead of many middle-income countries as well. So I think all we can do right now is make sure that we utilize every dose of vaccine we have. We make sure that we use up every dose of vaccine as quickly as possible and distribute these vaccines widely to make sure that we really reached the unreached populations. Your second question on prioritization, I'm afraid I go very much in the direction of saving lives. And that's why I think if I was to point out a policy step that I think that the government did not get right, we should have made sure that we had a high level of coverage in the older age groups before we descended all the way down to all adults. So the pace of descent, I think, was overly aspirational.
Okay, thank you. I think let me also perhaps ask a couple of, not asking questions, but some of the issues which Dr. Sudha has raised, particularly on the adaptation and transformation. I was wondering, Dr. Sudha, is it our approach was more only on adoption, or are we also we have seen several adaptation during this period? I think that's very important for a country, especially whether it is from the public sector, because we always, in India, there is an issue, because anything we look at the government, because we really ignore the community at large, or even the private sector at large. But if not from the government, I'm sure there would have been several adaptations, at least from the private sector, also from the community, etc., during a particular such a crisis like COVID-19. So can that also maybe a leads to in the future transformation of ideas also, which will adopt by the public health systems in the future? What do you think the possibilities of such a transformation which is happening in India?
Thank you so much, Professor James. I think that's a very, very valid and important question for us to think about. Yes, I would say that we were not naive enough to think we could absorb the extent of all this shock without putting in additional resources. So I would say that we did try at all levels to adapt better. We saw adaptations, in fact, at very different levels. Okay, one is right from the frontline workers. Okay, people were making more masks and distributing it. Nobody was really giving them instructions top down to do all these things. There were another adaptation was this like a local primary health center, which would instead of holding immunization days once in a week or camps like that, they distributed the immunization days so that they could maintain the social distancing and they could still cater to all the needs of the population. So we saw some really great adaptations that happened, and particularly at local level. In one of our studies from Dharavi, not just health sector, we saw a lot of people who, a lot of CSOs, like civil society organizations, and people who stepped up and did some fantastic work in distributing food and other things in the middle of the lockdown. I would say that the scale of the pandemic, the uncertainty combined with the lockdown posed a lot of difficulty to what we call as transformation. But what we need right now is much bigger changes, okay, the simpler, smaller changes, because what we are dealing with is a very complex problem. It's what we call in policy, these are wicked problems. Okay, so that any solution that we come up with has to acknowledge that complexity, okay, and then work with it. So the next step for us is, I think, not making small changes, but bigger, bolder reforms. And that's what we need. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. I think, Professor Ushara, maybe the questions in the chat box you can take up later, maybe who have access here.
Yes,
because we are
there
given
is one
a few.
question. There is one question.
Maybe that
from
we
chat
can take
box.
up later because
Yeah.
you can accumulate everything together.
Yes.
So maybe the others who are
From the panelists,
here,
they can ask.
ask questions. Yeah. So please unmute and please feel free to ask questions if anyone would like to ask. Because what happens, most of the participants can only give it in the chat box because we have not given access to everyone. But there are few who can ask directly, so they can ask questions.
Simply unmute yourself and raise the question. It's possible for them to individually unmute themselves.
My question,
Yeah, please go ahead, Professor Saxena.
my question is for the first,
Sir, you have to unmute yourself first. We can't hear you, sir.
It's unmuted, but its voice is slightly low. I think you are now muted. You have to unmute now. Now still muted. Yeah, you can come closer to your microphone and speak, Professor Saxena. Yeah, please speak. No, you are now muted again. Yeah, now you are unmuted. It's
now,
I think there's some voice issues with Professor Saxena. Maybe let them look at it. And I think Anupama, yeah, you can ask.
Yeah, maybe I can go. I just, I was actually, thank you for the talks. They were really very, very informative. But I was looking at Dr. Kang's presentation on that prioritization. And I think what's been worrying us for a long time is just wanted to get some views on children and, this whole aspect of their vaccination, because they have really taken quite a hit in terms of education and our schools not opening. Just some views on the vaccine for that age group.
So if we look at the recommendations, the vaccines are not licensed for young children yet. So the mRNA vaccines are licensed for 12 years and up and are being used in adolescents in the US and likely will come into other countries as well. The question really is, who do you vaccinate first? Do you vaccinate a 13-year-old adolescent that has very little chance of severe disease and mortality, or do you take that same vaccine and give it to someone who has a higher chance of dying if they get vaccinated? If you go by that prioritization, children don't figure in the vaccination at the moment. So this has been a topic of discussion at WHO as well. And the recommendations that we are currently making is that when countries have vaccine doses available, adolescents with comorbidities, not healthy adolescents, but adolescents with comorbidities who are at risk of severe disease if they get infected, should be vaccinated as a priority group. It has not come yet. It will come, but children are unlikely to be vaccinated before adults are vaccinated. Now, I know it worries people, But I think we really do need to look at the numbers because young children are very unlikely to have severe disease and mortality. I know that everyone wants to do, if you can do 99.9% instead of 99%, you want to do that for your children. But right now, if we think of global good, children don't figure. In terms of reopening schools and what needs to be done for schools, I think we understand a lot more about the virus now than we did before. So what I'm recommending is that all teachers, all adults in school should be vaccinated. All adolescents with comorbidities should be vaccinated. All schools should make sure that they have a system of ensuring that anybody who has symptoms is told to stay away from school, incentivized to stay away from school, whether it's a child or a teacher. Masking has to continue till we get vaccines. Ventilation is critical. And there are ways of checking ventilation in schools by measuring carbon dioxide concentrations. We are not thinking about that enough. And we really need to think about physical and environmental controls while we wait for policies and regulatory processes for vaccinating children. I think kids need to be back in school, but it will be, distancing, masking, choosing activities very carefully, protecting adults that we really need to make sure we have in place first before we think vaccines are the solution, because we have to remember vaccines are not perfect, not in, everybody. It has to be layered interventions. So vaccines help, but they don't do it all.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Yeah, any other questions?
Dr. Muralidhar has raised his hand, James.
Please go ahead. Yeah.
Let me first congratulate both presenters. So, answering the many questions related to the topic. However, I have two questions. I think Dr. Gagandeep may answer. One question is related to duration of immunity. Once a person is receives vaccination, of course, depending upon efficacy, 70 to 80% may develop immunity. But how long it lasts? Okay, so that is my question number one. And if it lasts forever, then second question doesn't apply. In case it doesn't last forever, then for how long it will last? And in that case, suppose, for example, it lasts for 10 months. Okay, so now herd immunity required is say 70 to 80%. So will it not be a concept of like active cases? One side cases are coming in, one side, other side recovering and going out. So similarly, in the top of immune people, one side people are getting immunized and coming in, and one side passing out that 10 months term and going out. So how, maybe you can highlight on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Muralidhar, for those questions. At the moment, we don't know how long protection lasts. So the data that we have is that protection from natural infection lasts for at least 8 months because that is all that we have measured. And protection from vaccine lasts for at least 6 months because that is all that we have measured. It is very likely that protection from natural infection and from vaccination will last longer than 6 or 8 months. We just haven't measured how much that is. Now, will there be breakdown of immunity? Will there be decay in immunity? Yes, I think it will be. But I think a lot of that will be determined by who you're looking at within the population. So among the elderly, we know that immunity induced by vaccination does not last as long as it does in younger individuals. So these are things that we are going to have to measure. We don't have all the answers for this at this time. Very important areas, but I'm sorry I can't give you a definitive answer now.
Yeah, that's true. I think there are so many unanswered questions at this time, either because of the lack of data or because we are still so early in the infection, so we really don't know what's going to happen in the future. Thank you. Any other questions?
No one is from panelist group, then maybe we could read out the
Yeah,
question. at
those
the
who have to unmute and speak because
No,
the
I
very
can speak out. I have taken it from the chat box. I can read
sure,
it
yeah,
out.
please
Yeah.
go ahead. Yeah.
So this is a question by Mr. Angad Singh, and the question is to Dr. Gagandeep. And I just read it as it is printed here. I want to know that what the situation will be after COVID-19 in the view of immunity debt. Because in the COVID-19 restriction, we are using masks, sanitizers, and other stuff to avoid COVID infection. In this situation, we are increasing our immunity debt for other viruses because we are away from those viruses who are existing in environment. In this regard, I want to know that how we will manage it in and how the government is looking at it.
Sure. So I think this is a very important question on immunity debt. And in fact, it is being seen in countries, particularly New Zealand at the moment is having a high rate of respiratory syncytial virus in neonates. And that's because last year they practically did not have an RSV season because there were movement restrictions. Similarly, people who work on flu are predicting that because of the lockdowns and we had a low flu season last year, and now that people are emerging and mingling, we are going to have a great upsurge of flu this year. And in fact, one of the reasons that the UK government is insisting on flu vaccination and booster doses of COVID-19 for the elderly is because they are worried about what will happen with respiratory infections in the coming few months in winter. So very important area, and it's certainly something that we need to continue to map. The question is, is 1 year sufficient for immunity debt? And it is for some viruses for which we don't make a good immune response, like influenza. And it is for viruses like RSV, where every new birth cohort is fresh fodder for the virus. So for most other things, fortunately, protection lasts a much longer time and we don't need to worry as much. I'm really sorry, I do have to leave now for another meeting, but I saw that there are a couple more questions that relate to getting pollutants and the role that they play in COVID infections. So I think one of the things that we were worried about last year in Delhi was, Delhi saw a peak that the rest of the country did not see. And it actually correlated with when Delhi's pollution was at its peak because of stubble burning. So I think the real proof of whether pollution matters is something that will emerge over time. It certainly appears likely that you have a double hit because of infection and pollution, but the data remain limited. There's another question about what happens if you don't get your second dose of vaccine on time, especially with changing variants. I hope that the slides that I showed you showed that against Delta, we have very good protection with 1 dose of vaccine. So when you get your second dose of vaccine, whenever you have the opportunity, go ahead and get it. You don't need to restart your vaccination schedule. You just need to complete it whenever you have the opportunity to do that. The current vaccine, can it protect us against future mutants? I'm sorry, but this is another wait and see question. So far, we know that the vaccines work for Alpha and for Delta. Some of the vaccines work reasonably for Beta and Gamma also. We don't know about Beta and Gamma for some of the vaccines that we have in India. and these are the conditions for which we need to make sure we generate the data. And the last question is about hesitancy of vaccines and about the prices. Actually, I don't think, given that we have always had vaccines that are in the national program given for free, I'm really glad that the government has made the decision that anybody who comes to a government facility will get COVID-19 vaccines for free. So price there is not a constraint. However, if in the future it plays out that some vaccines are better than others, especially when it comes to variants, and there are data that are emerging that seem to indicate that maybe the mRNA vaccines are better, maybe, still, early days, then will we wind up in a situation where only rich people can take mRNA vaccines and poor people have to take the vaccines that are in the program? It may happen, and cost would then not be leading to hesitancy. It would actually lead to the vaccine or a certain kind of vaccine being aspirational. So there are many ways this can play out. It's early days for us, but I think the most important message we must convey is that vaccines are safe, vaccines are effective, side effects are rare. We must measure side effects, but that should not outweigh our understanding of benefit being much, much greater than risk. We must get people vaccinated as much as possible. So apologies for needing to leave, but thank you so much for having me here.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Gagandeep. It has been wonderful to listen to you, as well as I think your reply to many questions has been also very informative for really to understand what's really happening, the vaccination as such, as a general public as well. So I'm sure for the researcher, it has been several points you have raised. Thank you so much for that. So we have, I think, I don't know, Professor Saxena is able to unmute, and if
No, I don't see that happening.
Okay. So any other questions? Otherwise, we will.
So there are no other questions either in chat box or anything, except there is one question in question answer session. How has the pandemic affected maternal and child health services, particularly in urban slum population? So it may be, Sudha, if you would want to take it up.
My question is, can I?
Okay, Dr. Saxena is able to speak. So Sudha, if you can hold on,
Please
please.
go ahead. Yeah.
My question is to Dr. Gagandeep. In the areas of Rajasthan, so, after the administration of the second dose of the vaccine, some people, quite a number of patients reported this black fungus on the skin of the patients, and after that they died. So what is that black fungus?
Yeah, for Saxena, unfortunately, Dr. Gagandeep has just left. So she has another meeting, urgent meeting. So she had to leave. So she's no more. We would definitely convey this question to her. So we are not able to get the answer right now, but we will convey these questions to her.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Dr. Sudha, you can go ahead and answer.
Thank you for that question. I think Dr. Ghosh has asked it, and if we talk about, so in our experience, our study was based in Dharavi, and we asked the community what kind of say challenges they faced in accessing maternal and child health services. What we found was they delayed immunization for their children. They also reported that they delayed ANC care. But when it comes to delivery, of course, these happen the way they should. but also this was an urban population. We have to remember there was a close proximity to Sion Hospital. So they didn't really face as many problems in the in either ANC, PNC or in delivery, but they were scared to go in for ANC and PNC because they were worried that if they go to the facilities, they might catch some other infection. According to the reports of the community, almost every service they considered could be postponed. They tried postponing it. They postponed to the private sector because, the public sector because of fear, and the private sector they postponed because they were running on very tight budgets. So they did not want to spend any money extra on doing anything which they considered non-essential. So both ways we found that routine services at least reportedly got affected in many ways. It was only the deliveries that we didn't find a big difference. That's my answer. Thank you again. Thank you.
Thank you.
No other pending question, James.
No other questions. Okay, that's it. Thank you. I think it's a great pleasure to thank both the speakers. I think it has been really wonderful, really, to know more about vaccination and also more about what really happened to the public health systems and its adaptation and transformation during a period of crisis. I think that is very, very important for any country. I think for India in particular, because we are always concerned with our public health systems. So I think thank you so much. I don't think that I need to really spend any time on this. So let me now request Professor Archana Roy to propose an vote of thanks. Professor Archana.
Thank you, sir. So, respected Director, Professor K.S. James, guest speaker of the day, Dr. Gagandeep Kang and Dr. Sudha Raman, senior scientists present here, Shirin Roy, and respected former faculties of the Institute, our most valued invited guests, our esteemed faculty, staff, dear students, ladies and gentlemen, a very good evening to all of you. So it's my proud privilege to propose a formal vote of thanks on the occasion of World Population Day 2021 of IIPS. So as we have learned that the world population and humanity is passing through a very difficult phase due to COVID-19 pandemic. And in spite of advancement in the medical sciences, we could not cope and manage our pandemic in time. And we have lost more than 40 lakhs people over the globe. So the pandemic has totally exposed the weak link of our society, that is healthcare system. And now we see that universal vaccination as an emerging ray of hope to fight against COVID-led situation. So in this backdrop, the Institute has organized this webinar on COVID-19 challenges for healthcare delivery and vaccination drives in India to observe the World Population Day. And friends, we had a very fruitful session by Dr. Gagandeep Kang and Dr. Sudha Raman. On behalf of IIPS, entire publication cell and STTP committee, esteemed guests present here, and my own behalf, I extend a very hearty vote of thanks to both the guest speakers who deliberated the issues very logically, and not as an academician, but also as a common people. We learned many things. And we also got a perspective of a doctor as well as a qualitative researcher in a holistic way. So friends, I must mention a deep sense of appreciation to both the speakers for their insightful, illustrative, and valuable deliberations. We hope their ideas and suggestions will help all the demographers to come up with new strategies. I, on behalf of Publication Cell and STTPs, and my own behalf, again, I express my gratitude to all the eminent invitees from the government offices, academicians from different institutions, participants from PRC, NGOs, for their participations. In this series, we would also like to thank our honored former faculties of IIPS. Present here are Professor Prem Saxena, Professor Prakasam, Professor Kamla Gupta, Professor Faujdar Ram, Professor Harish Srivastava for being with us on this occasion. We always seek your blessings, sir. We would like to express our gratitude to our esteemed colleagues and IIPS alumni members, staff, students, and all who spared their time and participate in this program. Our sincere gratitude to all of you. Without your participation, the program would have not been successful. I would like to take this opportunity to place our record, our hearty thanks to Professor James, who have always been providing our constant support, guidance, and autonomy in organizing any of the events. Thank you, sir. We extend our hearty thanks to our technical team and system manager, Mr. Anjani Kumar, and his colleague, Mr. Avinash, for handling the online meeting efficiently. Our thanks are also due to all the staff from administration, project support cell, director's office, account section for their cooperation and timely help in smooth organizing this event. Not only this time, but throughout last 2 years, we received a very responsive responses. Our heartfelt gratitude to all of you once again. We have been fortunate enough to be backed by this team, a highly dedicated and sincere colleagues, Mr. Santosh Kumar, Dr. Murugesan, and Mr. Rishabh Gupta, who had always been, I'd like to acknowledge each of them for their enormous cooperation and support. And friends, and this team is led by our captain, Professor Usha Ram, I must say, because she organizes the things in a very smooth and timely way, in a very perfect way. So thank you so much, ma'am. It has always been a learning experience from you. And at the end, I'll say that once again, that we are very grateful to all of you for being with us this evening to observe World Population Day. And it's our pleasure. And we hope that we will receive a constant support and participation in future too. So with this, I thank you all once again. Thank you.
I just want to add a few more sentences to this. I wouldn't take much of your time now. As today we complete this tenure of as coordinator to short-term training program and publication myself and Archana. I just want to put on record our sincere gratitude to Dr. James for first entrusting us with the task and with the guidance, support, suggestions that he gave throughout the 2 years tenure period that we have been able to organize the events that we really have done, which I think have been a lot more in terms of number, quantity, as well as quality than if we compare them with the past experiences at the Institute. So I think I just want to put that on record to you, Dr. James, and also to our sections in the Institute, whether it is administration, whether it is accounts, whether it is dispatch section, whether it is establishment or maintenance section, whether it is transportation section. For last 2.5 years, they have been really supporting us with various endeavors that we have been doing as a part of the routine activities of the STTP-PC. So a big thank you to everyone who has helped us. And in addition to the name that Archana mentioned of our STTP-PC cell, I would also really like to acknowledge the contribution of Mr. Naseem Mondal, who worked as a research officer for almost a year with the team in the last 2 years. So we really appreciate his cooperation and work that he did with the team as an integral part of the team. And now this is the time to say, Baba, I'm done. Thank you very much. I love you all. And good luck to Dr. T.V. Shekhar and Deepti Gobal, who will take it over from tomorrow onwards. And I'm very sure that they will deliver it much, much more than what we were able to really deliver in the past 2 years. With that, thank you very much. And we hope that all of you will continue to support us at IIPS in all these coming years as well. Thank you very much. And I really, really mean it from the bottom of my heart. And we would be sending a formal, of course, our appreciation and thank you letters to each one of you individually. And tomorrow morning is about that task that we have to do. Before I say, Shekhar, it is now your business. I'm done with it. Thank you very much. So Professor James, for you, if you have anything else to add.
Thank you. I think that has been really wonderful. I think 2 years of appreciate your service for the Institute and also for the advancement of the knowledge in the area of demography and health. Thank you so much to both of you. And the meeting is closed. Thank you once again.
Thank you one and all. Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Have a good evening and stay safe.